Hello everybody and welcome back to another video on the channel, and in today's video I have the long awaited updated PvP guide for 2024. Now I've been getting these comments for the last couple of months and I see them. That's why I am here making the video today. I did make a couple of PvP guides last year as well, but obviously they're kind of outdated now. So I'm going to try and include everything I can in this video. A lot of the things are very intricate, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. I will try my best to answer all of them. It's always a little tough for me to make videos like this because like I can yap about something and then I have to like assume people know part of, you know, what I'm talking about, and sometimes they don't, so I will do my best to go slow and break things down for y'all. Alright, so I'm actually going to be editing this part in. I forgot to actually include the whole Rhoshambo system, which is basically like the entire new game that KingsIsle's built the past like 2 years or so. Basically, in case you don't know, the entire game before like level 150 or 160 is like labeled as like quote-unquote legacy. And now, after that, in the present day, there's Rhoshambo. So with Rhoshambo, I'll put it up on screen right now. It's basically, they're giving every school a different identity. So for example, a lot of players like the Legacy of Freet with the weakness. However, with the new game KingsIsle's building, that's going to be getting banned pretty soon because fire has nothing to do with weaknesses anymore with the new game design. And basically how Rhoshambo works is 3 schools basically are good at something. So fire, for example, is the dot school. It's also really good with hots, and it's also really good at traps, and it also will counter 2 things, which in this case is going to be traps and shield, and that theme kind of goes off of everybody. Now we also have hard and soft counter matchups. So how that works basically is a hard counter matchup is essentially going to make your life miserable. Like, you can't do 90% of the things in your deck without falling over and dying. So a good example is like ice for a storm, right? If I blade, the ice just counters the blades. If I weakness, the ice counters the weaknesses. If I aura, the ice counters the aura. So the only thing I could do on a storm within the Rhoshambo and the new game design is heal and use that healing against the ice to try and win that matchup. So that's kind of how the whole identity works, and when you guys really study the wheel, it makes a lot more sense. I do have plenty of guides on the channel here, thoroughly explaining the Rhoshambo if you want to educate yourself more on the new direction Wiz has been going the past year or two within PvP and advanced content. If you guys enjoyed this video, by the way, feel free to leave a like and a sub, guys. Videos like this do take a lot of time for me to make, and if you guys need help with anything specifically, like I said at the start, please just let me know in the comments below. I do have pet guides and stuff like that as well, Spellament guides and Rhoshambo guides on the channel here. I can't really include all that in this video, or else we'd be here for like 2 hours, right? So there are guides for everything I'm talking about on the channel here, whether it's like walkthrough, you know, the raid stuff, you know, jewels, pets, yada yada, all that stuff is here on the channel. Anyways, I'm gonna stop yapping. I will let you guys get back into the video. My bad. Okay, so to PvP, we all know about the barrier to entry. So if you want a PvP, what kind of gear am I going to need in general, Liam? Okay, well, currently, right now, in the current meta we have as of April 2024, the basically meta set in general is going to look something like this on the screen. Now, I am on a storm. It's a little bit different on the other schools. Typically, the other schools run Hunhow Robe instead of Stalker, because they can actually afford to give up stats, unlike a storm. So all of these pieces are pretty much from either a pack, which is the hat, or the raid, which is like the boots and the wand. If you don't have the Hunhow Robe, you probably could get away with running Stalker on almost every school. The only school I'd really argue you need Stalker Robe on is a Storm, though. I would recommend Hunhow Robe for every other school. Now you're probably like, okay, Liam, well, why is this raid gear and this pack gear meta? This is meta simply because shads are meta once again. If you don't have 4-piece shad, you're gonna notice your games become nearly impossible to win. There's a lot of things that go into that, right? simply because Dark Surge is an extremely pivotal and powerful move that only costs 1 shad for a lot of tempo and value. Also, in general, if you have the higher shad rating, you can therefore threaten your shad hit first and kind of like manipulate the game. So for example, if I'm on a storm and I'm running 4-piece shad and my opponent has like 2-piece shad, for example, I'm going to get the Rusalka off first, therefore they're going to have to debuff, and I can play around the fact that they're going to debuff and then go for a ton of hidden buffs and kind of make them fall over and die. So the game kind of becomes a cakewalk for the people that do have 4-piece shad, and if you don't have it, you're kind of just, you know, a sitting duck, I guess is the best way to put it. So that's why you kind of need to have this gear, is because it gives up the least amount of stats while still giving you that shad rating, which is kind of why we're all in this meta of pack gear and raid gear being the best stuff in the game. Alright, so we talked about the gear, the pack stuff, the raid stuff. Now, let's talk about the pet a little bit. Now, the meta pets are different on every school. I guess I can go over all of them in this video. I might as well just include everything in it. Sure, why the hell not? Currently on a storm right now, the best way to win is to simply by stacking a couple of buffs, like a blade trapped in aura, and going for like a big owl or something like that. So what I've decided to do is actually make a rain core pet that gives me a blade, a thunderstorm item card that's really powerful and nobody ever expects, because they have to worry about dying to your owl. And if they mess up in shield, you could just send this and basically throw them off guard and have like an upwards to 1900 damage per pip overtime on the opponent. If you're a regular Storm player who doesn't want to stack a couple of buffs and one-shot people, I'd recommend the Storm Nullity Dragon. It's just a really solid pet. You get this from the Nullity raid, the Void raid, I think, the first one, I believe. It's really good, it's exclusive, so if you don't beat the raid and get the pet drop, you actually can't hatch with somebody and get the body back. And if you don't raid, I guess the beetle isn't terrible as well. The beetle is still a pretty good pet on a storm. I would just argue the other ones are a bit better in more situations generally. Okay, so I'm gonna try and speed through all the pets here. Now, I'm still working on the fire meta pet. Essentially, what you're actually gonna want on the pet is a triple-double bubble pet. Like a Lord of Summer pet body is going to be the best option on a fire, because that 35 bubble copy is really important. If you don't have that but you've raided, also the Nullity Dragon is really good, simply because people can't shield against you, because fire is the hard counter to shields. So the only way to counter them then is to weakness. But the Dark Pact Nullity Dragon counter weaknesses and buffs you up even more to make you even more scary on a fire. This is the set I am running on the fire. Very similar to the storm set you guys saw. Again, I'm running Hun Hao instead of Stalker robe right here. So, you know, just screenshot this if you want and try and get that for yourself if you can. Okay, next up on the ice. This is pretty self-explanatory. Don't really gotta say much here. The Blint pet is the best in the game. It's simply because it gives you 2 35 bubble copies, and that's it. It's the only pet in the whole entire game that does this. But yeah, it's just the best because it simply has something that no other school has, and that's 2 35 bubble item cards on the pet. Next up on the balance, I would recommend a Rain Beetle pet. If you don't have the Rain Beetle pet, the next best would probably be the Deadly Nullity Dragon. If you don't raid, I would just run the Rain Beetle pet on a balance though. It is still a very solid option. Next up on the myth, I will show you guys the myth setup as well. It's basically very similar to, again, the fire one. I think it's actually identical. Yeah, I think it's like quite literally the same thing. I just don't have a mount on this character, so just throw on like a damage mount if you have it, like a Myth Culture or Clockwork Courser, and you will be pretty freaking good. In terms of myth pets, there's 2 options you have. You could go for a bubble pet simply because myth, you can't like debuff a myth, so the only way to actually do something against a myth is bubble. But if you make a bubble pet and you know, prepare for that, you're simply just fine, and it's kind of hard to lose the game. So with the amount of offensive pressure a myth has with their damage per pip, and the fact they can hit through shields and weaknesses and nuke their opponent, bubble pet is pretty freaking good with the pressure. However, if you don't have that, I would say a beetle pet is okay. I don't see a lot of people running it, but it definitely can work. I've seen it work before. And then otherwise, like a Mythic Melody Dragon for the fuel, or the Maple Moose pet as well for the fuel isn't bad. I would say generally the bubble pet is better, just like to slot in the meta, simply because how, you know, Myth works with Rhoshambo and the interactions in the game right now. I think bubble is a safer bet. Because if you have the fuel pet against like a balance maybe, or like a counter matchup like a life or a fire, you're just gonna fall over and die. So you would prefer having a bubble pet in that matchup, and the bubble will help you in basically every other matchup, aside from maybe a myth mirror. But even then, you could run trap counters on the myth and be fine. All right, next up on the death, you have a couple of options. Death doesn't really have a set in stone best pet. I've seen a couple of death wizards be running the threefold pet. It's not bad simply because it's like 1 pip, and you know, Death Scion and Vampire are still incredibly powerful even in the new meta. Other than that, I'd recommend having a set bonus pet because Death has the best stats in the game, and by simply having an extra set bonus pet, you make your stats even better on top of them already being the best in the game. Death Dactyl, not bad. Death Scarab is pretty good. The Blade is pretty helpful, and the Pact is not bad as well. Okay, next up on the Life. Now, Life has some options, kind of like Death. I'd say Life, I mean, you don't have a lot of options, I'll be honest. You can run the Leaffoot pet, which is pretty good. You get an extra Sanctuary bubble copy, which is very helpful. However, if you are a more offensive Life player, I'd recommend the Fern Lumi. I like having the Fern Lumi personally, just because I'm an offensive player in general. Okay, so we talked about the meta pet for every school. We talked about the gear setups as well. I don't have the gear setup for everybody because, you know, having to raid and buy packs for every school is, you know, it's quite a bit to ask for. It's a lot, you know, so I only have the raid gear setups for Fire, Myth, and Storm right now, currently. But like I said, generally, it's about the same template as I showed in the video. Like, you know, Wastelander hat, Hunhow, Shabalba, that kind of thing. Now, next up, let's talk about dual school and what the best dual school is on every single school. So, starting off with Storm, I think Storm's best dual school is simply going to be Myth. Now, this is just simply because Myth counters all the things that counter Storm. So I can pack Keeper and like get around towers and keep my Storm buffs and create another Storm buff. I can pack King Artorias and get around weaknesses and create another Storm buff. I can pack Minotaur, get around shields, counter them, and create another Storm buff. Also, Myth Banshee is extremely good right now in the meta, so dueling into Myth and getting accuracy and some damage for them is by far the best thing you could do on a Storm. Life isn't bad, but the issue is if you do Life, Death basically counters Life and Storm, and Death is like the most popular and best school in the game right now. So doing that combination is simply just asking to lose. Also, if you do that combination, you're kind of just covering less bases than you would be packing the myth spells right here. Next up, on a fire, I'm gonna have to recommend Ice. Ice is actually really good on a fire because you cover a lot of bases again, right? So on a fire, I counter shields, obviously with like King Art and Elephant, which is really good. And then if I duel into Ice, I can actually counter auras, counter weaknesses, and counter blades. Which only makes me bad against Hots and Dots, but I can pretty much just do that to my opponent as well and outplay them. The only bad part about this setup is you kind of lose to life, but even if you pack like Triton and stuff like that, like, yeah, I guess you could win, but it's really tough to win still. Life just kind of dogs fire in general, so even if you set for it, you're probably gonna lose. So I just recommend having this setup and, you know, winning these 6 other matchups in the game right now. It is an absolute demon of a dual school, and I've hardly been losing with it. Next up, on an Ice, the best dual school I think I'm gonna have to recommend is going to be Storm. Now, the reason I say Storm is simply because on an Ice, you counter weaknesses and blades. Your hard counter, which is basically fire and even myth, they both have a dot identity to them. So if you duel into Storm, you can actually counter dots and not, you know, get blown up by your counter matchups. Also, life is really good as well. So having a hot counter like Triton is really, really freaking helpful. So that only makes you bad against shields, I'm pretty sure, if I'm not missing anything, and traps, but you could simply pack like Jin's defense if you wanted on your ice. You could pack Earthquake, but you'll probably fizzle that because you can only get accuracy to one school generally, right? So I'd recommend just packing JD. Next up on a balance, I think the best dual school I'm gonna have to recommend is going to be Storm yet again. This helps you a lot with people that might just buff up a lot and send a big dot. You can stop that while dueling in a Storm and countering the OT. Also, again, healing is pretty good on a life, so having Triton as a heal counter is really good. Generally, on a balance, you can do stuff against Blades with like Eye of Vigilance and, you know, Scarab as well, and same thing with traps. It's a little tough to beat somebody that's stacking on a balance, but, you know, if you pace yourself right and you're a good player, you do have a chance, and I do think dueling in a Storm is your best ability to cover all bases and have the highest win rate. Next up on the death, this actually might be a bit of a hot take, but I actually think death should not be dual schooling with Storm. And the reason I say that, guys, is simply because you only counter one thing, right? You're only countering dots. You're not really countering hots because you already do that by default on a death. So in my opinion, I think it's actually better to dual school with a myth or an ice, because that way, if you do myth, you're countering weaknesses and shields, or an ice, you're countering blades and you're also countering weaknesses. And if people do buff up and send like a brain dead dot, you can still like weakness and use your chromatic effects and play around drains that are really broken. So honestly, it might be a hot take, but I feel like Storm is okay. But I think the best would be to go into either myth or ice dual school on a death. Next up on a myth, you have two options. You can either dual school with fire to basically create a lot of pressure with like Fire Elf and Nathib Scarab, or you can dual school with Storm, which is, you know, they're kind of both reactive things, right? If they debuff with a tower, you go for like an elf and then create more pressure. Or if they dot or hot you, you just counter it and go from there. So both are pretty good. I've seen about like a 50-50 split at high ranks between fire and Storm, sorry. I would say personally I like fire dual school more on my myth. It's easier to do and you have a lot more synergy with spells like Glimpse of Infinity, which is really, really cracked. So personally, I prefer fire. I do understand why people like to run Storm dual school on the myth though. It is also really, really good. Okay, so now we are on a life. Now, this is probably the one I'm most uncomfortable answering. I haven't really seen or played a lot of lives. All the lives I play basically are like jading and stuff like that. So they have like accuracy to every school. So they can like Earthquake, Banshee, and just be really annoying and obnoxious. So on a life, in theory, you could duel into myth to pack Earthquake to counter blades and also counter shields and also counter weaknesses, to which you would only be weak against other hots, but then that's a life mirror, and life mirrors never end up well anyways. I guess you could do ice if you want to counter weaknesses and blades and like stuff like that, but I don't really know how I feel about that because you're just gonna wall the blades, which is 100% accuracy, so what's the point in dueling into it then? And yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I could include in the video for now. I mean, I can make videos talking about every specific build and setup and why it's so good and intricate and stuff like that, guys. I'll probably be doing that pretty soon. I haven't really done that because I've been, you know, playing Wiz a lot less lately and stuff like that, but I can definitely get back into it now that I'm having fun with the new meta again. If you guys found this video useful at all, feel free to leave a like or a sub. I'd really, really appreciate it, guys, and I will see you on the next one. Thank you for watching, and take care.